In the misty Cornish village of St. Mary's Cove, a fisherman's body washes up in shallow waters, death too strange to be an accident. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eyes unravel a web of secrets. A bitter rival, a frightened wife, a nervous deckhand, and a shadowy smuggler. As whispers of smuggling and betrayal swirl, Miss Marple follows clues from a locked drawer to a hidden cave, piecing together a motive of greed that led to murder. In just 30 seconds, dive into a tale of deception where the tide reveals the truth and no secret stays buried long. Chapter 1. The Body in the Shallows. The sun had barely crested the jagged cliffs of St. Mary's Cove, a quaint fishing village nestled against the Cornish coast, when the first whispers of tragedy stirred the morning air. A thin veil of mist hung over the harbour, softening the outlines of weathered boats bobbing in the tide. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the rhythmic slap of waves on the shingle. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a bench outside Mrs. Bantry's rented cottage, was absorbed in her knitting, her fingers deftly working pale blue wool into a shawl for a nephew's child. Her eyes, however, were not on the needles but on the village below, where fishermen hauled nets and women bartered over baskets of mackerel. St. Mary's Cove, she thought, was not unlike St. Mary Mead, full of small lives and large secrets. The tranquility shattered with the sudden clamour of running feet. A boy no older than 12, his face flushed and his cap askew, sprinted up from the shore, his shouts cutting through the morning hum. "A body! There's a body in the cove!" he cried, his voice cracking with panic. A crowd gathered swiftly, abandoning their nets, women clutching shawls, children darting between legs to gape. Miss Marple, with the calm precision of one accustomed to village dramas, tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, her slight figure moving toward the commotion with surprising purpose. Mrs. Bantry, emerging from the cottage in a flurry of curiosity, fell into step beside her. "What's this, Jane? Trouble already?" she asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. The crowd parted at the water's edge, revealing a grim tableau. In the shallows, where the tide lapped gently against smooth pebbles, lay Tom Pierce, a fisherman of some repute in St. Mary's Cove. His body was sprawled awkwardly, half in and half out of the water, his oilskin coat sodden and tangled with strands of dark seaweed. His face, weathered by years at sea, was pale, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some crossed themselves, others whispered of curses. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted the unnatural stillness of the scene. The way Tom's boots were lodged in the rocks, as if he'd been caught unawares. Dr. Haydock, a brisk man with a greying beard, pushed through to kneel beside the body. His examination was brief but thorough, his hands steady as he checked for signs of life. "Drowned," he pronounced, standing and brushing wet sand from his trousers. "No doubt about it. Lungs full of water, by the look of him." A collective gasp arose, followed by a puzzled silence. Constable Pauk, a stout young officer with a habit of tugging his earlobe when perplexed, stepped forward. "Drowned in this." He gestured at the shallow water, barely deep enough to cover a man's knees. Tom Pierce knew these waters better than anyone. Swam like a fish, he did. How's a man like that drown in a puddle? The crowd murmured agreement, their voices a low hum of suspicion. Miss Marple, her head tilted slightly, observed the scene with her characteristic clarity. The shallows were indeed an odd place for such a death. Tom's oilskin, she noted, was torn at the shoulder. and a faint bruise marked his temple, though it could have been from the rocks. Her eyes drifted to the crowd. Jack Tregarron, Tom's rival, stood at the back, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Eliza Pierce, Tom's wife, hovered near the cottages, her shawl drawn tight. Young Will Cody, Tom's deckhand, lingered nervously at the edge, his hands twisting a length of rope. And beyond, near the cliffs, a lone figure, Silas Vane, the reclusive boatman, watched with eyes like chips of flint. Mrs. Bantry, catching Miss Marple's gaze, leaned close. "What do you make of it, Jane? It's downright peculiar, isn't it?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her eyes still scanning the crowd. "Very peculiar, Dolly. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a farmer who fell into a stream and drowned, but that was no accident. The shallows here remind me of that stream, deceptively simple, yet full of secrets." She adjusted her hat, her voice soft but firm. "I think, Dolly, we shall find that Tom Percy's death is not what it seems. People, you know, are rarely so careless with their lives." As the crowd dispersed, Constable Polk roped off the cove, and Dr. Haydock arranged for the body to be moved. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her gaze settling on the ripples in the shallow water, as if they might whisper what Tom Pierce could not. The village, she knew, would talk, and in its talk she would find the threads of truth. With a final glance at the cliffs, where Silas Vane had vanished, she turned back to the cottage, her mind already weaving the first strands of a pattern only she could see. Chapter 2. The Village. Whispers. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary's Cove, burning off the morning mist and casting a golden sheen across the harbour. The village, though small, thrummed with life nets drying on racks, the clatter of buckets, the sharp temps of fish and salt in the air. Yet beneath this ordinary bustle lay a current of unease, as if the discovery of Tom Percy's body had stirred something restless in the heart of the community. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table in Mrs. Bantry's rented cottage, sipped her morning tea, her knitting needles lying idle for once. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, followed the comings and goings through the window, where villagers passed in knots of twos and threes, their voices low, their glances furtive. Mrs. Bantry, ever the eager hostess, bustled in with a tray of scones, her face alight with the thrill of scandal. "Oh, Jane, the village is positively buzzing," she exclaimed, setting the tray down with a clatter. "You should have heard the maid, Elsie, just now. She's been to the bakery and says everyone's talking about Tom Pierce, drowned in the shallows. It's the queerest thing, isn't it?" She sank into a chair, her eyes wide. "What do you make of it? Surely it's no accident." Miss Marple set her teacup down with a delicate clink, her expression serene, but her mind already sifting through the morning's observations. "It is certainly unusual, Dolly," she replied, her voice soft but precise. "A man like Tom Pierce, accustomed to the sea, does not simply drown in water shallow enough for a child to wade in. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a gardener who fell into a pond and was thought to have drowned, but it turned out to be quite another matter. Villagers, you see, have a way of hiding their truths in plain sight." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity insatiable. "You mean murder, don't you, Jane? Oh, do tell. Who do you think did it?" But Miss Marple only smiled, her fingers brushing the edge of her saucer. "It's far too soon to say, Dolly, but the village will tell us, in its way. Gossip, you know, is like a skein of wool, tangled at first, but with patience one can unravel it." As if on cue, Elsie, the young maid, entered with a fresh pot of tea, her cheeks flushed from her errands. She was a sturdy girl with a round face and a tendency to speak before thinking, a trait Miss Marple found most useful. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Elsie said, glancing at Mrs. Bantry. "But the village is all a chatter about poor Tom Pierce. They're saying he had enemies, plenty of 'em. There's Jack Tregeron, who near came to blows with him last week over fishing spots. And then there's Eliza, his wife. Folks say she wasn't happy, not with Tom's ways. And young Will Cody, his deckhand, always looking like a whipped dog. Oh, and Silas Vane." Elsie's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say he's mixed up in smuggling, and Tom might have crossed him." Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled. "Smuggling, how thrilling. What else did you hear, Elsie?" The maid hesitated, then plunged on. "Well, ma'am, at the bakery, old Mrs. Tuttle said she saw Tom arguing with Jack Tregeron 2 nights ago, down by the Red Anchor. Said Jack was red in the face, shouting about Tom's nets cutting into his grounds. And then there's Eliza, she keeps to herself, but folks say she's been seen crying by the cliffs. As for Will, he's been jumpy as a cat, and some say he was out late the night Tom died, though he won't say where. And Silas, well, no one trusts him. His boat's always out when it shouldn't be." Miss Marple listened, her face composed, but her mind cataloguing every detail. Elsie's gossip was a patchwork, but patches, she knew, could be stitched into a whole. "Thank you, Elsie," she said kindly. "You've been most helpful." The maid bobbed a curtsy and retreated, leaving Mrs. Bantry practically bouncing in her seat. "Jane, it's like one of your novels. Enemies everywhere. Where do we start?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her gaze drifting to the window. "We start, Dolly, by listening. The village is like a clockage tick, and talk tells a story if you know how to hear it. Let us walk to the harbour. People talk freely there, and we may learn more." The 2 women set out, Miss Marple in her neat tweed coat and hat, her step light despite her years, and Mrs. Bantry striding beside her, barely containing her excitement. The harbour was a hive of activity, men mending nets, women sorting fish, children darting about with buckets. The air was thick with the scent of brine and tar, and the gulls' cries were a constant chorus. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the scene, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the glances exchanged when certain names were mentioned. She paused by a group of women gutting fish, their knives flashing with practiced ease. One, a stout woman with greying hair, was speaking in a low, indignant tone. "It's a disgrace." "That's what it is," she said, slicing a mackerel with unnecessary force. "Tom Pierce was no saint, but to die like that, in the shallows, it's not natural. I reckon Jack Tregeron had a hand in it. Always jealous, he was, of Tom's catches. Everyone knows he threatened to sink Tom's boat last month." Another woman, younger and sharpered, shook her head. "It's not Jack I'd look at. Eliza Pierce has more reason than most. Tom was a brute to her, everyone's seen the marks. She's quiet, but quiet ones can snap. My cousin's friend in Penzance knew a woman who poisoned her husband for less." Miss Marple, pretending to admire a nearby boat, listened intently. The women's voices carried a mix of conviction and speculation, each thread revealing a piece of Tom Pierce's life. She noted the mention of marks on Eliza Brewster's, perhaps like the one she'd glimpsed on the Fisherman's temple. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the docks, where a group of men had gathered around a pile of nets. At their centre stood Jack Tregeron, his broad shoulders hunched as he argued with a smaller man, his voice carrying over the wind. I tell you, I had nothing to do with it, Jack roared, his face flushed. Tom was a cheat, but I'd not stoop to killing him. Ask anyone at the Red Anchor. I was there till midnight. The smaller man, a fishmonger named Ned, snorted. Convenient, that. Tom was seen alive at dusk, and no one saw you leave the pub till late. Plenty of time to settle a score. Miss Marple edged closer, her presence unnoticed amid the crowd. Jack's anger was palpable, but there was something else, a flicker of unease in his eyes, a slight tremor in his calloused hands as he gestured. She made a mental note. Jack's alibi was strong, but alibis, she knew, could be crafted. In St. Mary Mead, a butcher had once sworn he was at a dance while his rival's shop burned, only to be undone by a single ash on his sleeve. Mrs. Bantry, tugging at Miss Marple's arm, whispered, "He's awfully defensive, isn't he? Do you think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple's lips twitched. Perhaps, Dolly, but anger is often a mask for fear or guilt. Let us see what else the village has to say. They moved on, passing the Red Anchor, a weathered pub with peeling paint and a creaking sign. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the low hum of conversation. Miss Marple, with Mrs. Bantry as her eager shadow, stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The landlord, a jovial man named Harry, was wiping glasses behind the bar, his ear attuned to the chatter of his patrons. He nodded as Miss Marple approached, her manner disarming as she inquired about the villagers' mood. "Oh, it's a right mess, miss," Harry said, leaning forward. Tom Pierce was no favourite, mind you. Always picking fights, he was. Jack Tregerron's been in here every night, cursing Tom's name over his pints. But then, Tom wasn't kind to his boy, Will Cody, neither. Lad's been jumpy since it happened, came in last night, pale as a ghost, wouldn't say a word. And Eliza, poor soul, she's not been seen here since Tom started staying out late. Folks say she knew he was up to something. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Up to something? What might that be, Mr. Harry? The landlord hesitated, then lowered his voice. Well, miss, there's talk of smuggling round these parts. Silas Bain's name comes up often. His boat, the Black Gull, is out when honest men are asleep. Tom was seen near the cliffs last week, poking about where Silas moors. Might have seen something he shouldn't. Mrs. Bantry gasped, but Miss Marple merely nodded, her mind filing away the mention of Silas Vane. Smuggling was an old trade in Cornwall, and men had killed for less than a crate of contraband. She thanked Harry and led Mrs. Bantry outside, where the harbour sparkled under the midday sun. They paused by a bench overlooking the cliffs, where Silas's boat rocked gently in the distance. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, her thoughts turning to the cave she would later find its secrets hidden by the tide. "Dolly," she said at last, "this village is like a tapestry, each thread a story. Tom Pierce was not a man without fault, and fault breeds enemies. Jack Tregerron's anger, Eliza's silence, Will's fear, Silas's shadows, they all weave together. But which thread, I wonder, pulled tight enough to end a life?" Mrs. Bantry, fanning herself with a handkerchief, was practically vibrating with excitement. "You're on to something, Jane. I can feel it. Shall we talk to Elisa next? Or perhaps Will?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not yet, Dolly. Let us watch a little longer. In St. Mary Mead, I once solved a theft by noticing a woman's gloves clean when they should have been soiled. Details, you see, are the key. and St. Mary's Cove has many details to share. As they returned to the cottage, the village continued its dance of whispers and glances. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as her knitting needles, was already sorting the threads. Jack's feud, Eliza's bruises, Will's nervousness, Silas's secrecy. Somewhere among them lay the truth of Tom Pearce's death, and she would find it, as she always did, by listening to the villagers' quiet song. Chapter 3. The Rival's Tale. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary's Cove, casting long shadows across the harbour where boats rocked gently against their moorings. The air was thick with the scent of salt and tar, mingled with the faint bitterness of drying fish. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat buttoned against the brisk sea breeze, walked purposefully toward the docks, her small figure dwarfed by the towering masts and coiled ropes. Mrs. Bantry, trailing behind, struggled to match her friend's steady pace, her face alight with the prospect of uncovering more of the village's secrets. "Jane, you're like a bloodhound on the scent," she exclaimed, puffing slightly. "Where are we off to now?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "To see Jack Tregoran, Dolly. The village has much to say about him, and I find that a man's own words often reveal more than gossip. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a blacksmith who swore he'd never touched a stolen horse, but his hands told a different story. We shall see what Mr. Hands and eyes have to tell." They found Jack Tregoran at the far end of the harbour, crouched beside his boat, the Seahawk, his broad shoulders hunched as he mended a torn net with quick, angry stitches. He was a man in his late 40s, with a face weathered by sun and storm, his dark hair streaked with grey, and his hands scarred from years of hauling lines. His reputation as Tom Pearce's rival was well known. Their feud over fishing grounds had been the talk of St. Mary's Cove for months, culminating in a brawl at the Red Anchor that had left both men bruised and the pub's landlord threatening to bar them. As Miss Marple approached, Jack's eyes flicked up, narrowing at the sight of strangers. He straightened, wiping his hands on his oilskin trousers, his posture wary but not hostile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Tregoran," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but clear, as if addressing an old acquaintance. "I am Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead, and this is Mrs. Bantry. We were sorry to hear of Tom Pearce's death. A shocking thing in such shallow waters." Jack's jaw tightened, and he tossed the net aside with a grunt. "Shocking, aye, but Tom was no friend of mine. He'd a knack for trouble, that one. Still, I didn't wish him dead." His voice was gruff, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for a coil of rope, a nervous gesture that belied his bravado. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, leaned forward. "They say you and Tom had a falling out, Mr. Tregoran, quite a row, I hear, over fishing grounds. Is it true you threatened him?" Her tone was eager, almost theatrical, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle nudge, her smile reproving. Jack's face reddened, and he spat into the sand. "Village talk, that's all. We fought. Tom was a cheat, always casting his nets where mine were set, claiming the best grounds as his own. Stole my catches, he did, with that cursed luck of his. But threaten him, I'd sooner see him shamed than drowned." His eyes, however, darted toward the cliffs, where the sea churned against the rocks, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something fear. Perhaps, or guilt before he masked it with a scowl. Constable Polk, who had joined them quietly, tugged at his earlobe, a habit Miss Marple had already noted as a sign of his unease. Jack, You were at the Red Anchor the night Tom died, weren't you? Till midnight, you said. Plenty of folk saw you there, but no one saw Tom after dusk. Where were you before the pub? His tone was cautious, as if he feared pushing too hard. Jack's hands stilled on the rope, and he fixed Poke with a hard stare. I was here, mending my nets, same as always. Ask Ned, the fishmonger. He passed by around 6. After that, I went to the pub. You can ask Harry, the landlord, or any of the lads there. I didn't see Tom, and I didn't touch him. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers tightened on the rope. The knuckles whitening. Mrs. Bantry, undeterred, pressed further. But you must have been angry, Mr. Tregoran. Everyone says Tom's catches were better than anyone's this season. That must have stung. Jack's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might snap. Instead, he laughed, a harsh sound that carried no mirth. Better catches. Luck, that's what it was. Tom's nets were always full, like he knew where the fish would be. Uncanny, it was, but I didn't kill him for it. I'm no murderer. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly, her mind snagging on his words. Luck, she murmured, almost to herself. How curious. Fishermen, I understand, are superstitious about such things. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer once called his neighbour's bumper crop unnatural and was proven right when we found the stolen seed. Tell me, Mr. Tregoran, what made Tom's luck so remarkable? Jack hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if weighing her intent. He always knew the best spots, he said at last. Even when the fish weren't running, Tom's boat came back heavy. Last week, I saw him near the cliffs, poking about where no honest fisherman goes. Said he was checking traps, but I didn't believe him. Too close to Silas Vane's mooring. That was. He stopped abruptly, as if regretting his words, and turned back to his nets with a grunt. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Mrs. Bantry, whose eyebrows shot up. Silas Vane's name had surfaced again, like a fish breaking the water's surface. She made a mental note of Jack's mention of the cliffs, recalling the cave she would later discover its entrance hidden by seaweed. Thank you, Mr. Tregoran, she said, her voice as mild as ever. You've been most helpful. We shan't keep you from your work. As they walked back toward the cottage, Mrs. Bantry could barely contain herself. Jane, did you see his hands? Shaking like a leaf. And that business about Tom's luck, there's something there, isn't there? Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts already weaving a pattern. Indeed, Dolly, Jack Tregoran is a proud man, and pride can mask many things, envy, even fear. But his talk of Tom's uncanny luck interests me. Fishermen are practical men, yet they cling to superstitions. If Tom's success was unnatural, as Jack suggests, it may point to something more than fish. They paused by the harbour's edge, where the tide was turning, leaving pools of water among the rocks. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the cliffs, where Silas Vane's boat, the Black Gull, lay moored. Its dark hull barely visible in the fading light. In St. Mary Mead, she said softly, a man once blamed his rival's luck for his own failures, only to find the rival was cheating at cards. Luck, Dolly, is often a word for something else, mayhaps, or secrets. Jack Tregoran may not be our murderer, but he knows more than he says. Mrs. Bantry shivered, though whether from the breeze or the thrill of the mystery, she could not say. You're building a case, Jane, I can tell. Shall we go after Silas next, or perhaps Eliza? Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her hat against the wind. Patience, Dolly. The village is like a book, and we've only read the first pages. Jack Tregarrin has given us a clue, whether he meant to or not. Let us see where it leads. As they turned back to the cottage, the harbour grew quiet, the fishermen retreating to their homes as the sky deepened to twilight. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from quiet, turning over Jack's words, his trembling hands, and the shadow of Silas Vane's boat against the cliffs. The truth, she knew, was there, waiting to be hooked like a fish from the depths. Chapter 4. The wife's silence. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Eliza Pierce's cottage, casting delicate shadows across the worn floorboards. The small dwelling, perched on a rise overlooking St. Mary's Cove, was as neat as a pin, its scrubbed surfaces and modest furnishings betraying a meticulous hand. Yet there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something unspoken that hung like damp laundry. Miss Jane Marple, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, sat in a straight-backed chair in the parlour, her eyes taking in every detail: the faded photograph of a younger Tom Pierce on the mantel, the mended cushions, the faint scent of lavender. Polish, Mrs. Bantry, beside her, fidgeted with her handbag, her eagerness barely contained as she awaited the arrival of Tom's widow. Eliza Pierce entered quietly, her footsteps soft as if she feared disturbing the stillness. She was a woman in her early 40s, slight and pale, with dark hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her eyes, shadowed with fatigue, avoided direct contact, and her hands clutched a damp handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. She wore a plain grey dress, its sleeves long enough to cover her wrists, though Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught the edge of a bruise peeking out as Eliza adjusted her shawl. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pierce," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but measured, like a neighbour offering condolences. "I am Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead, and this is Mrs. Bantry. We are so very sorry for your loss. May we speak with you a moment?" Eliza nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she sank into a chair opposite them. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's kind of you to call." Her fingers twisted the handkerchief, and Miss Marple noted the nervous gesture, so like the anxious fidgeting of a young woman in St. Mary Mead who had hidden her husband's debts until they could no longer be concealed. Mrs. Bantry, never one for subtlety, leaned forward. "It must be dreadful, Mrs. Pierce, losing your husband so suddenly, and in such an odd way drowned in the shallows. The village is full of talk about it. Do you have any idea what happened?" Her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes gleamed with curiosity, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle glance, urging restraint. Eliza's hands stilled, and her gaze flickered to the window, where the sea glimmered beyond the cliffs. "I don't know," she said at last, her voice flat. "Tom went out at dusk, as he often did, to check his nets. He didn't come home. I thought he'd stopped at the Red Anchor, like he sometimes did. Then they found him." Her words were careful, rehearsed almost, and Miss Marple's mind registered the absence of emotion, as if Eliza were reciting a lesson learned by rote. "You were home that evening, then?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a breeze. "Alone, I presume, mending or perhaps reading." She gestured toward a basket of sewing by the hearth, her eyes noting the needle and thread left atop a half-finished shirt. Eliza nodded, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "Yes, I was mending Tom's shirts, mostly. I didn't go out." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the way her eyes darted to a small sideboard in the corner. The sideboard was polished to a shine, but one drawer, slightly ajar, had a lock that gleamed as if recently used. When Eliza rose to adjust a cushion, her sleeve brushed the sideboard, and the drawer rattled faintly as if something inside had shifted. Mrs. Bantry, catching the sound, opened her mouth to speak, but Miss Marple forestalled her with a subtle shake of her head. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said, her voice softening further, "being alone now, with so many memories. Tom was a fisherman, I understand, and a successful one. Did he often speak of his work, of the sea, or perhaps the cliffs where he set his nets?" Eliza's eyes flickered again, this time with a trace of alarm. "He didn't talk much," she said quickly. "Tom kept to himself about his work. Fishing, checking traps, that was all. He was a hard man sometimes, but he provided." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away, her hand moving to cover her wrist. Miss Marple's gaze followed, noting the bruise, again faint, purplish, shaped like fingers. It was not fresh, but neither was it old, and Miss Marple's mind filed it away, recalling a woman in St. Mary Mead whose quiet demeanour had hidden years of silent suffering. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, pressed on. "The village," says Tom, "had enemies, Jack Tregourn for one, and that Silas Vane, who they say is mixed up in smuggling. Did Tom ever mention them, or anything unusual?" Her voice was eager, almost too eager, and Eliza's shoulders stiffened. "I don't listen to gossip," Eliza said sharply, then softened, as if regretting her tone. "Tom and Jack argued, yes, but that's Fisherman for you. As for Silas, Tom didn't trust him, but he never said why. He just told me to stay away from the cliffs." Her words came faster now, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided the sideboard, as if it held something she feared to acknowledge. "Quite sensible advice," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "The cliffs can be treacherous, I'm told. In St. Mary Mead, we had a young man who wandered too close to a quarry and met with misfortune. Curiosity, you know, can be dangerous." She paused, her eyes resting on Eliza's face, searching for a reaction. But Eliza only nodded. Her expression closed, and Miss Marple sensed that further questions would yield little today. They rose to leave, Miss Marple offering a few more words of condolence. As they stepped toward the door, her foot brushed the sideboard, and the drawer rattled again, louder this time. Eliza flinched, her hand darting out as if to steady it. But she caught herself and turned away. Miss Marple's smile remained serene, but her mind was alight with possibilities. A locked drawer, a bruise, a widow's silence, these were threads in the tapestry of St. Mary's Cove, and she would weave them together in time. Outside, the air was cool, the sea a restless murmur against the shore. Mrs. Bantry, bursting with questions, grabbed Miss Marple's arm as soon as they were out of earshot. "Jane, she's hiding something. Did you see that bruise? And that drawer's there's something in it. I'd wager my best hat. Do you think she killed Tom? Or knows who did?" Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her eyes scanning the horizon where the cliffs loomed dark against the fading light. "Eliza Pierce is frightened, Dolly," she said quietly, "and frightened people keep secrets. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a woman who wept for her husband while hiding the poison that killed him. Grief can be a mask, but so can fear. That bruise and that drawer, they tell a story, but not the whole one. We must be patient." Mrs. Bantry groaned, her impatience bubbling over. Patient. Jane, you're maddening sometimes. What about Silas Vane? Or that nervous deckhand, Will? Shouldn't we talk to them next? Miss Marple smiled, her step light as they descended the path to the village. All in good time, Dolly. The village is like a puzzle, and each piece fits only when you know its shape. Eliza has given us a piece today, and I suspect that drawer will give us another before long. As they reached the harbour, the lights of St. Mary's Cove began to twinkle, small beacons against the gathering dusk. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from the cosy glow of the village. It was fixed on the bruise, the locked drawer, and the shadow of fear in Eliza's eyes, clues that, like the tide, would reveal their secrets in time. Chapter 5. The deckhands fear the morning tide rolled into St. Mary's Cove with a gentle insistence, lapping at the pebbled shore as the village stirred to life. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of seaweed and the distant temps of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked along the harbour path, her eyes scanning the bustle of fishermen and market women with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to seeing. Beneath surfaces, Mrs. Bantry, ever her enthusiastic shadow, matched her stride, though her chatter was subdued by the early hour. "Jane, you've been awfully quiet since we left Eliza's," she said, glancing sideways. "That bruise and that drawer, they're on your mind, aren't they?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her hands clasped lightly before her. "They are, Dolly, but there are other threads to follow. Young Will Cody, for instance. The village speaks of him as nervous, almost frightened. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a boy who trembled whenever his master's name was mentioned, and it turned out he'd seen something he dared not tell. Fear, you know, is a window into truth. Their destination was the harbour's edge, where Tom Pearce's boat, the Salty Maid, bobbed against its mooring, its hull weathered but sturdy. There, hunched over a pile of ropes, was Will Cody, Tom's deckhand, a lanky youth of barely 20, with sandy hair and a face that seemed perpetually poised on the edge of flight. His hands moved quickly, scrubbing the deck with a vigour that suggested he wished to erase more than salt stains. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached, he glanced up, his eyes wide and darting, like a rabbit caught in a lantern's beam. "Good morning, Mr. Cody," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a fireside. "I am Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead, and this is Mrs. Bantry. We were hoping to speak with you about poor Mr. Pearce. Such a tragedy, and you working so closely with him." Will's hands paused, the scrub brush dripping onto the deck. "A tragedy," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the creak of the boat. "Didn't expect it, not like that." His stammer was faint but noticeable, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers gripped the brush, as if anchoring himself against a storm only he could see. Mrs. Bantry, sensing an opening, leaned forward. "It must have been dreadful, Will, finding out Tom drowned in such shallow water. You were with him often, weren't you? Did he seem worried about anything? Enemies, perhaps?" Her tone was kind, but her eagerness made Will flinch, his eyes flicking toward the cliffs where the sea churned against dark rocks. "Tom wasn't one for worrying," Will said, his words halting. "He was hard, always shouting, docking my pay if a net tore or a catch was light. But I didn't wish him harm." His gaze dropped to the deck, and Miss Marple caught the tremor in his voice, the way his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead, a gardener's boy who had stammered just so when questioned about a stolen silver tray. his fear betraying what his words concealed. "You were at the shed that evening, I believe," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes soft but piercing. "Repairing nets, were you? It must be lonely work, there by the harbour, with the village settling down for the night." She paused, watching his face. "Did you see Tom, perhaps, or anyone else near the cove?" Will's head jerked up, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment before skittering away. "I was in the shed, like I said. Didn't see Tom. Didn't see anyone." His voice cracked, and he scrubbed harder at the deck, the brush scraping against wood with a rhythmic rasp. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the cliffs, where Silas Fane's boat, the Black Gull, lay moored. Its dark shape a silent sentinel against the morning sky. Will's eyes followed hers, and a shadow crossed his face. So brief it might have been missed by a less observant eye. Mrs. Bantry, undeterred by his reticence, pressed on. "But Will, surely you noticed something? The village says Tom had enemies, Jack Tregoran, for one, and that Silas Fane. Did Tom ever speak of them, or of anything strange, out by the cliffs?" Her voice was bright, almost coaxing, but it only made Will's hands shake more visibly. "Tom didn't talk much to me," he said, his stammer growing pronounced. "Just orders, mostly. Stay away from the cliffs, he'd say. Dangerous, with the tides. I kept out of it." His eyes darted again to the Black Gull, and Miss Marple's mind registered the fear in that glance, as tangible as the salt in the air. She thought of the cave she would later find, its entrance hidden by seaweed, and wondered what Will might have seen nor chosen not to see. "You're a good lad, Will," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, as if speaking to a nervous child. "It's hard, working for a man like Tom, I imagine. In St. Mary Mead, we had a boy who worked for a harsh employer, and he saw things he was too frightened to tell. But truth, you know, has a way of coming out like the tide." She smiled, her eyes holding his for a moment, and she saw the flicker of panic there, quickly masked as he bent back to his work as they turned to leave. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Jane, he's terrified. Did you see how he looked at Silas's boat? He knows something, I'm sure of it." Miss Marple nodded, her step light on the uneven path. "He does, Dolly, but fear is a heavy chain. Will Cody is like a bird in a cage, fluttering but unable to fly in St. Mary Mead. A boy like him once kept silent about a theft until the guilt broke him. We shall see if Will's silence holds." They paused by the harbour's edge, where the tide was retreating, leaving glistening pools among the rocks. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the Black Gull, its hull dark against the water, and she thought of the whispers about Silas Fane's late-night voyages, his elusive manner, Will's fear, Eliza's bruise, Jack's anger. They were pieces of a puzzle, each jagged edge waiting to fit. "The village is telling us a story, Dolly," she said softly, "and young Will Cody is a chapter we must read carefully." Mrs. Bantry, her excitement barely contained, tugged at Miss Marple's sleeve. "What next, Jane? Shall we find Silas, or go back to Eliza's drawer? Oh, it's like a novel." Miss Marple's smile was patient, her eyes still fixed on the distant boat. "Patience, Dolly. The truth is like a net, it must be cast wide and drawn in slowly. Will has given us a thread, and I suspect it leads to the cliffs. Let us see where the tide takes us next." As they walked back to the cottage, the village settled into its morning rhythm, but Miss Marple's mind was far from settled. Will Cody's fear, like the bruise on Eliza's wrist, was a clue that whispered of secrets deeper than the shallows where Tom Pierce had died. Chapter 6. The Smuggler's Shadow. The cliffs of St. Mary's Cove loomed stark against the midday sky, their rugged faces weathered by centuries of wind and wave. The sea below churned restlessly, its foam-flecked surface hiding secrets in its depths. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, made her way toward the cliff's edge, her shawl fluttering in the brisk breeze. Mrs. Bantry followed, her enthusiasm undimmed by the steep climb, though she clutched her hat to keep it from flying off. "Jane, are we really going to confront that Silas Vane?" she asked, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "He sounds positively sinister with all this talk of smuggling." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained composed. "Not confront, Dollyabs. Silas Vane is a man who moves in shadows, and shadows are best seen from a distance. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a poacher who kept his traps hidden in the woods, but his boots gave him a wemmed, where there should have been none. We shall see what Mr. Vane's boots, or perhaps his boat, reveal." Their destination was the narrow inlet where Silas Vane's boat, the Black Gull, was moored. It was a sleek, dark vessel, smaller than the fishing boats that crowded the harbour, its hull polished to a gleam that suggested car-oar concealment. The inlet was secluded, tucked beneath an overhang of cliffs, where the tide hissed against jagged rocks. As they approached, Miss Marple noted the absence of other villagers, no fishermen mending nets, no children playing in the shallows. The isolation felt deliberate, as if the place itself guarded Silas Vane's secrets. Silas himself was there, leaning against a boulder, his lean frame coiled with the wary alertness of a fox. He was a man of indeterminate age, his face lined but his eyes sharp, like chips of slate under a stormy sky. His oilskin coat was patched but clean, and a knife hung at his belt, its handle worn from use. He straightened as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached, his smile thin and unwelcoming. "Ladies," he said, his voice smooth but edged with caution. "A bit far from the village, aren't you? The cliffs aren't safe for a stroll." Miss Marple returned his smile, her manner as disarming as a vicar's wife offering tea. "We're quite sturdy, Mr. Vane. I am Miss Marple, from St. Mary Mead, and this is Mrs. Bantry. We were admiring the view and thought to pay our respects. The village is much distressed by Tom Pearce's death, and we understand you knew him." Silas's eyes narrowed, though his smile held. "Knew him? I, as much as anyone knows a man like Tom, always poking about, he was, never content with his own patch of sea." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand strayed to the knife, a reflex rather than a threat. "Sorry to hear he's gone, but the sea's a hard mistress. Takes what she wants." Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, blurted, but drowning in shallow water, "Mr. Vane, surely that's no accident. The village says Tom crossed you something about your boat, perhaps, or what you do with it at night." Her voice was bright, almost accusatory, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle nudge, her smile apologetic. Silas's laugh was sharp, like the crack of a whip. "Village gossip, is it? They'll say I'm smuggling brandy next, or dancing with mermaids. I was at sea that night, fishing far from the cove. Ask the Coast Guard they saw the Black Gull out past the headland at dusk." His eyes met Miss Marple's, challenging, but she saw something else, a flicker of calculation, as if he were measuring how much she knew. "Fishing at night must be lonely work," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "In St. Mary Mead, we had a man who hunted by moonlight, and it turned out he was after more than rabbits. Tom, I hear, was seen near these cliffs before he died." Did he ever speak to you about his fishing spots, or perhaps something he found here?" Her eyes, soft but piercing, held his, and she saw the brief tightening of his jaw. "Tom was a fool," Silas said, his voice low, always nosing where he wasn't wanted. "Said he saw something near my mooring once, but I told him to mind his own nets. He didn't listen. He turned away, busying himself with a coil of rope, but Miss Marple noted the stiffness in his movements, the way his hand lingered near the knife. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the tension, whispered, "Jane, he's hiding something. Did you see that knife? And the way he talks about Tom?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the cliffs, where a narrow path led to a cave she would later explore. "Indeed, Dolly, Silas Vane is a man who knows more than he says, and his secrets are tied to these cliffs. In St. Mary Mead, a man like him once hid stolen goods in a barn, and his confidence was his undoing. We shall see if Mr. Vane's confidence holds." As they made their way back to the village, the sea growled behind them, its rhythm a reminder of the tides that hid and revealed. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving together Silas's evasions, Will's fear, Eliza's bruise, and Jack's anger. The smuggler's shadow loomed large, but shadows, she knew, were cast by something solid. "The cliffs, Dolly," she said, softly, "are more than they seem. And Silas Vane, I think, is their keeper." Mrs. Bantry, her excitement barely contained, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Are we going to that cave next, Jane? Or back to Eliza? Oh, it's thrilling." Miss Marple's smile was patient, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "All in good time, Dolly. The truth is like the tide, it comes in slowly, but it always comes." Chapter 7. The Tide's Secrets. The sun dipped low over St. Mary's Cove, painting the sea with streaks of amber and rose as the tide began its retreat. The air was cool now, with a sharpness that hinted at the coming evening, and the village settled into a quieter rhythm, the bustle of the harbour giving way to the soft clatter of supper preparations. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, stood at the edge of the cove where Tom Pars's body had been found. Her eyes, keen despite the fading light, traced the line of the shallows, where pebbles glistened and seaweed clung to jagged rocks. Mrs. Bantry, ever her enthusiastic companion, hovered nearby, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Jane, it's positively eerie here," she said, her voice hushed. "To think Tom drowned in water barely deep enough to wet your ankles. Are you sure we should be poking about like this?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, reassuring smile. "Quite sure, Dolly. The sea keeps its secrets, but it leaves clues for those who look. In St. Mary Mead, I once found a stolen locket in a stream, revealed when the water receded. This cove, I think, has something to tell us about Tom Pierce." She stepped carefully onto the damp pebbles, her sensible shoes steady despite the uneven ground, and began to examine the spot where the fisherman's body had lain. The shallows were indeed perplexing, scarcely a foot deep, even at high tide, with rocks that would bruise but hardly drown a man of Tom's strength and experience. Miss Marple crouched, her gloved hand brushing aside a strand of seaweed to reveal a cluster of crushed shells, their edges sharp and newly broken. Her eyes followed a faint trail of such shells, leading from the water's edge toward the cliffs, where a narrow path wound upward to a shadowed overhang. She straightened, her mind turning over the possibilities. "Curious," she murmured, almost to herself. "A man does not drown in such a place unless he is held there or caught unawares." Mrs. Bantry, peering over her shoulder, gasped. Jane, do you mean he was forced under? But who could do such a thing? And why here, of all places? Her eyes darted to the cliffs, where the sea's restless churn seemed to whisper of hidden things. Marple did not answer at once, her gaze fixed on the path of crushed shells. Let us follow this trail, Dolly, she said, her voice calm but purposeful. It may lead us to something Tom saw, something someone wished him not to see. They made their way along the path, the pebbles giving way to coarse sand, and then to the rough stone of the cliff face. The trail ended at a low, seaweed-draped opening in your cave, its entrance half hidden by the tide's leavings and the shadow of the overhang. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied the scene. The cave's mouth was narrow, but wide enough for a man to slip through, and the air within carried a faint, briny temps, mingled with something sharper, brandy, perhaps, or tobacco. Dolly, Miss Marple said softly, I believe we have found something significant. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer once hid stolen grain in a hollow tree, thinking the leaves would conceal it. But nature, like the tide, has a way of revealing what men hide. She stepped closer, peering into the cave's dim interior, and her sharp eyes caught the glint of something tucked behind a boulder or wooden crate, its edges marked with strange chalked symbols that spoke of foreign ports. Mrs. Bantry, her excitement barely contained, clapped her hands. Jane, it's smuggled goods, isn't it? Brandy, or something worse. Do you think Tom found this, and that's why he was killed? Her voice echoed slightly in the cave, and Miss Marple raised a finger to her lips, her expression cautious. Not so loud, Dolly, she said, her tone gentle but firm. The cliffs have ears, and we are not alone in this village. But you may be right. Tom Pierce was a man who knew these waters, and if he stumbled upon this cave, he may have seen more than fish. She stepped back, her mind cataloguing the crate's symbols, the crushed shells, the shallow water where Tom had died. It was a pattern, incomplete but growing clearer, and she knew it pointed to secrets that someone had killed to protect. They returned to the village, Miss Marple insisting they fetch Constable Polk before disturbing the cave further. The young officer, his face flushed with the importance of the discovery, arrived with a lantern and a notebook, his earlobe-tugging habit more pronounced than ever. Smuggled goods, you say? He muttered, peering into the cave. Brandy, most like, from across the channel. We've had suspicions about such things, but no proof till now. He examined the crate, noting its markings, and jotted them down with a frown. If Tom found this, it's no wonder he met trouble. Smugglers don't take kindly to nosy fishermen. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes wide, clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, this changes everything. It must be Silas Vane. His boat's always near these cliffs, and Will looked so frightened when he saw it. Do you think Tom was killed to keep him quiet? Her voice was a mix of thrill and horror, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps, Dolly, she said, her voice low, but we must not leap to conclusions. In St. Mary Mead, a man was once blamed for a theft because his cart was seen near the scene. But it was another who used it to hide his crime. Silas Vane may be our smuggler, but we must be sure this cave and its contents are a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. Her eyes drifted back to the cove, where the tide was now fully out, revealing more of the rocky floor. She thought of Will's nervous glances, Eliza's locked drawer, Jack's talk of Tom's uncanny luck. Each was a thread, and the cave was another, weaving a net that would soon ensnare the truth. As they walked back to the cottage, The village lights flickered to life, casting a warm glow against the gathering dusk. Constable Polk promised to guard the cave and investigate the crate's origins. But Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere, turning over the implications of their find. "The tide, Dolly," she said softly, "hides much, but it cannot hide forever. Tom Pierce saw something in these cliffs, and someone ensured he would never speak of it. We are close, I think, to knowing who." Mrs. Bantry, her scarf now hopelessly tangled, shook her head in admiration. "Jane, you're a marvel. What next? Shall we confront Silas, or search Eliza's drawer?" Miss Marple's smile was patient, her eyes fixed on the distant cliffs. "Patience, Dolly. The truth is like the sit moves in its own time, but it always comes to shore." Chapter 8. The Locked Drawer. The morning light spilled softly through the windows of Eliza Pierce's cottage, illuminating the modest parlour with a gentle glow that belied the tension within. The room was as tidy as ever, its polished surfaces and neatly arranged furnishings speaking of a woman who found solace in order, even amidst grief. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more in the straight-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observed the space with her usual quiet acuity. The photograph of Tom Pierce on the mantel seemed to watch over the room, its faded edges a reminder of years gone by. Mrs. Bantry, perched beside her, was less composed, her fingers drumming lightly on her handbag as she awaited Eliza's return. From the kitchen, where she had gone to fetch tea, "Jane, I can't stop thinking about that drawer," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her eyes darting to the sideboard in the corner. "You heard it rattle yesterday, and Eliza nearly jumped out of her skin. There's something in there, I'm sure of it, something she doesn't want us to see." Her voice was hushed but brimming with excitement, and Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Patience, Dolly," she murmured, her eyes resting on the sideboard's locked drawer, its brass keyhole gleaming faintly in the morning light. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who kept her husband's letters in a locked box, thinking them safe from prying eyes. But secrets, you see, have a way of calling attention to themselves. We shall learn what Eliza hides, but we must tread carefully." Eliza entered, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups, her movements precise but her face pale, her eyes shadowed with the strain of sleepless nights. She set the tray down, her hands steady but her fingers lingering on the teapot's handle, as if reluctant to let go. "I hope you're comfortable," she said, her voice low and strained. "It's kind of you to visit again." Her gaze flickered to the sideboard, so briefly it might have gone unnoticed, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught it, noting the way Eliza's shoulders tensed. "We're grateful for your hospitality, Mrs. Pierce," Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as a summer afternoon. "It's a difficult time, and company can be a comfort, even if only for a moment. I was thinking of Tom, such a strong man, so at home on the sea. Did he ever write to you, perhaps, when he was out fishing? Letters can be such a treasure, can't they?" Eliza's hand froze on the teacup she was pouring, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "Tom wasn't much for writing," she said quickly, her eyes fixed on the tea. "He'd leave notes sometimes, about supplies or such, but nothing more." Her voice was too quick, too careful, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around the cup, her knuckles whitening. Mrs. Bantry, seizing the moment, leaned forward. "Oh, but surely he left something, Mrs. Pierce. A note, a keepsake. I keep all my husband's letters in a little box. It's so comforting to read them over. Have you anything like that?" Her tone was bright, almost innocent, but Eyes darted to the sideboard again, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of panic there, as clear as a beacon. "I don't keep such things," Eliza said, her voice faltering. Tom didn't like clutter. She rose abruptly, as if to clear the tray, and her sleeve brushed the sideboard. The locked drawer rattled again, a soft but unmistakable sound, and Eliza's hand shot out to steady it, her face paling further. Miss Marple, her expression unchanged, made a mental note of the drawer's contents papers, perhaps, or something heavier, given the sound. Clutter can be a nuisance. Miss Marple said smoothly, rising as if to help with the tray. "In St. Mary Mead, I knew a woman who kept her troubles locked away, thinking them safe, but they came out all the same. A drawer like that one, for instance," she gestured lightly toward the sideboard. Her voice, gentle but deliberate, might hold all sorts of memories. "Would you mind if I took a look? Sometimes small things can bring great comfort." Eliza's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed poised to refuse. But Miss Marple's gaze, soft yet unyielding, held hers, and something in the older woman's calm authority seemed to unravel her resolve. "It's just old things," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing important." But her hands trembled as she reached for a small key hanging on a chain at her neck, and she hesitated, as if weighing the cost of refusal. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the moment, stood as well, her enthusiasm barely contained. "Oh, do let us see. Mrs. Pierce, it might help, you know, to share a memory or two." Her eagerness was almost too much, and Miss Marple gave her a subtle glance, urging restraint. Eliza's shoulders slumped, and with a reluctant nod, she unlocked the drawer, her movements slow, as if each turn of the key pained her. The drawer slid open to reveal a bundle of letters, tied with a frayed ribbon, their edges worn but the handwriting bold and unmistakable. Miss Marple, with a murmured "May I?" lifted the bundle, her gloved fingers careful as she untied the ribbon. The letters were from Tom, written in a hurried, uneven hand, and as she skimmed them, her eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. The letters were brief, urgent notes, warning Eliza to stay clear of the caves and mind veins lot. One, dated a week before Tom's death, read, "Eliza, keep to the house. They're watching, and I've seen too much. Don't trust SV." Another mentioned crates in the cliffs, and no good will come of it. The final letter, dated the day before his death, was a single line, "If I don't come back, burn these." Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the letters to the cave, the crate, and Silas Vane's shadowed presence. Mrs. Bantry, peering over her shoulder, gasped, "Jane, these are about smuggling. Tom knew about Silas Vane, didn't he? And he was afraid." Her voice was a hushed exclamation, and Eliza flinched, her hands twisting the handkerchief into knots. "I didn't want to know," Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. "Tom told me to stay out of it, to keep quiet. He said it was dangerous, that they'd hurt us if I spoke. I should have listened, should have burned them." Her words dissolved into a sob, and she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, her voice soothing. "You did what you thought was right, my dear. Secrets are heavy, and fear makes them heavier. In St. Mary Mead, a woman once kept silent about her husband's debts, thinking it would protect him, but silence only delays the truth. You've helped us greatly today." She tied the ribbon round the letters and slipped them into her bag, her movements deliberate. "We shall keep these safe, and Constable Pock will need to see them." As they left the cottage, Mrs. Bantry was practically vibrating with excitement. "Jane, those letters. They point straight to Silas Vane. Tom knew about the smuggling, and that's why he was killed, isn't it? Oh, we're getting close now. Her scarf fluttered wildly as she gestured, and Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her hat against the breeze. Close, perhaps, Dolly, she said, her voice calm but her mind alight with connections. The letters are a thread, and they lead to the cliffs, to Silas Vane, and perhaps to others. But we must be careful. In St. Mary Mead, a man once hid his crimes in a locked box, thinking it safe, but the truth always finds a key. We shall see what Constable Pock makes of this. They descended the path to the village, the sea a restless murmur behind them. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Will Cody's fear, Jack Tregoron's anger, and the crate in the cave. The net was tightening, and she knew that soon the truth would surface, as inevitable as the tide. Chapter 9. The smuggler's alibi. Cracks. The midday sun cast a harsh light over St. Mary's Cove, bleaching the harbour's timbers and glinting off the waves with a clarity that seemed to mock the village's secrets. The air was thick with the scent of salt and fish, and the distant cry of gulls punctuated the hum of daily life nets being mended. Barrels rolled across the docks, women haggling over baskets of cod. Yet beneath this surface of routine, a current of unease ran strong, stirred by the discovery of Tom Purse's body and the whispers that followed. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly pinned, stood outside the Red Anchor pub, her eyes scanning the harbour with the quiet vigilance of one who saw more than she let on. Mrs. Bantry, at her side, clutched the bundle of Tom's letters, her face alight with the thrill of their recent find. "Jane, those letters are dynamite," she whispered, her voice barely contained. "Silas Vane is as good as caught, isn't he? We must take these to Constable Poke at once." Miss Marple's lips curved in a gentle, reproving smile. "Not quite caught, Dolly, but closer, perhaps. The letters are a window, but we must look through it carefully. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man whose diary pointed to a thief, but it was the thief's brother who held the key. Let us share these with Constable Poke, but let us also watch Silas Vane. His alibi, I think, may not be as watertight as he claims. They made their way to the small police station, a squat building near the harbour, with a single window and a door that creaked on its hinges. Constable Poke was inside, his desk cluttered with papers and a half-eaten scone, his earlobe red from constant tugging. He rose as they entered, his face brightening at the sight of Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, what brings you?" "More news about Tom Pierce." His voice held a mix of eagerness and apprehension, as if he sensed the weight of what they carried. Miss Marple handed him the bundle of letters, her manner calm but purposeful. "These, Constable, were found in Mrs. Pierce's cottage, in a locked drawer. They are from Tom, written in the days before his death. I believe you'll find them most illuminating." She watched as Poke untied the ribbon, his eyes scanning the hurried scrawl, his brow furrowing as he read of Vane's lot and crates in the cliffs. When he reached the final note, "If I don't come back, burn these," his hand stilled, and he looked up, his face pale. "This is serious, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "These point straight to Silas Vane and smuggling. Tom knew something, didn't he? And it got him killed." He rubbed his earlobe, his mind racing. Silas swore he was at sea that night, past the headland, said the Coast Guard saw the Black Gull there at dusk. But if Tom saw crates and these letters, he trailed off, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's, seeking guidance. Indeed, Constable, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. An alibi is only as strong as its witnesses, and witnesses can be mistaken or persuaded. In St. Mary Mead, a man once claimed he was at a fair when a barn burned, but a child's word undid him. I suggest you speak to Silas again, and perhaps to others who were near the cliffs that night. The truth, you know, is like a fish, it slips away unless you hold it fast. Poke nodded, tucking the letters into a drawer with a promise to secure them as evidence. I'll bring Silas in for questioning, he said, his resolve hardening, and I'll check with the Coast Guard again. If the Black Gull was closer to shore than he let on. He left the thought unfinished, but Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet approval. As they left the station, Mrs. Bantry could barely contain herself. Jane, we're closing in. Silas is the key, isn't he? Those letters, that crate in the cave, all fits. She waved her hands, her scarf fluttering like a flag. Miss Marple's smile was patient, her gaze drifting to the cliffs where the Black Gull rocked in its mooring. Let us not be too hasty, Dolly, she said. Silas Vane is a piece of the puzzle, but puzzles have many pieces. We must test his alibi, and we must listen to the village. Someone, I think, saw more than they've said. Her mind turned to Will Cody's nervous glances, to Eliza's fear, to Jack Tregoran's trembling hands. The letters had tightened the net, but it was not yet drawn in. They decided to linger near the harbour, where the afternoon bustle offered a chance to overhear the village's pulse. As they sat on a bench by the docks, a young boy barefoot, with a fishing rod slung over his shoulder, passed by, his face alight with the importance of news. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such moments, called out to him, "Young man, you look as if you've something to tell." "I'm Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead. Have you heard anything about poor Mr. Pierce?" The boy, whose name was Tommy, grinned, eager to share. "Oh, I was fishing by the headland at dusk, the night Tom died. Saw the Black Gull coming in, not out past the headland like Silas says. It was near the cove, close to where Tom was found. Didn't think much of it till now, but folk are saying Silas is trouble." He puffed out his chest, proud of his contribution, and scampered off before Miss Marple could ask more. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Jane, did you hear that?" Silas lied. His boat was in the cove, not out at sea. He must have done it. Her voice rose, and Miss Marple raised a finger, her expression cautioning calm. "A child's word is a start, Dolly," she said, "but we need more. In St. Mary Mead, a boy once saw a man in a garden at midnight, but it was the man's shadow, not his guilt, that was clear. Let us see what Silas says when confronted." She rose, her step light but purposeful, and they made their way to the cliffs, where Constable Poke had gone to summon Silas Vane. They found him near the Black Gull, his lean frame taut as he coiled a rope with deliberate care. Poke stood nearby, his notebook open, his face stern. "Silas," he said, his voice carrying over the wind, "young Tommy says he saw your boat in the cove at dusk, not out past the headland. Care to explain that?" Silas's hands stilled, and his eyes slate grey and unreadable flicked too. Poke then to Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry. His smile was gone, replaced by a tightness that betrayed his unease. "The boy's mistaken," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "I was out fishing, like I said. Came back briefly to check. My nets, maybe, but I wasn't near the cove long. You've no proof I was with Tom." His hand strayed to the knife at his belt. a reflex Miss Marple noted with interest, and his jaw clenched as Poke pressed further. "Those letters of Tom's say otherwise," Poke said, his tone firm. "He knew about your crates, Silas, knew. You were smuggling. If he threatened to talk, that's motive enough." Silas's eyes darkened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might bolt. But he only laughed a harsh, hollow sound. "Letters, gossip, you'll need more than that." "Poke," he said, turning back to his rope. But Miss Marple saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered near the knife, and she knew his alibi was fraying like a worn net as they left the cliffs. Mrs. Bantry was beside herself. "Jane, his guilty as sin. Did you see his face? And that knife, he's dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving together the boy's testimony, the letters, and the crate in the cave. "He is a man under pressure, Dolly," she said softly, "and pressure makes cracks. In St. Mary Mead, a man once swore he was innocent until a single footprint undid him. Silas Vane's footprint, I think, is in that cove." They returned to the cottage, the village settling into the evening's quiet. Miss Marple's thoughts were busy, turning over Silas's lie, Will's fear, and the letter's warnings. The net was drawing tighter, and she sensed the truth was near, waiting to be pulled from the depths. Chapter 10. The Deckhand's Confession. The twilight sky over St. Mary's Cove was a tapestry of deepening blues and purples, the last rays of sunlight glinting off the harbour's restless waters. The village had settled into a hushed stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of a boat or the distant call of a gull. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close against the evening chill, stood outside the small shed where Will Cody, Tom Perce's deckhand, was said to spend his evenings, mending nets. The shed was a ramshackle affair, its weathered boards patched with tar and its single window clouded with grime. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager, hovered at her side, her scarf fluttering as she whispered, "Jane, are we really going to press that poor boy? He's so nervous, he might bolt like a frightened colt." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "We must, Dolly. Young Will Cody is like a locked door, and fear is the key. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a lad who saw a theft but kept silent out of terror until a gentle word loosened his tongue. Will has seen something, I'm certain, and we must help him speak." Her voice was soft but resolute, and she stepped forward, knocking lightly on the shed's door. The door creaked open, revealing Will's lanky frame, his sandy hair dishevelled and his eyes wide with apprehension. He clutched a coil of rope, his knuckles pale, and his stammer was more pronounced than before. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's this about? I've got work to do." His gaze darted past them, toward the cliffs where the black gull lay moored, its dark shape a silent menace in the fading light. "We shan't keep you long, Will," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "We've been speaking with Constable Pauck about Tom Pierce, and we've learned things, letters, a crate in the cliffs, a boat scene where it shouldn't have been. You were close to Tom, working on his boat. If you saw something that night, it's best to tell us now. The truth, you know, is a heavy burden to carry alone." Will's face paled, and he stepped back, the rope slipping from his hands to the floor. I didn't see nothing," he stammered, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with a fear so raw it seemed to pulse in the air. Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his hands twitched as if longing to flee. She thought of a boy in St. Mary Mead, caught stealing apples, whose trembling hands had given him away before his words did dot Mrs. Bantry. Sensing the boy's distress, softened her usual exuberance. "Will, you're frightened. Anyone can see that. Was it?" "Silas Vane, did he threaten you? We only want to help, you know." Her voice was kind, but it carried an edge of urgency, and Will flinched. His back pressing against the shed's wall, Constable Pock, who had joined them quietly, cleared his throat, his notebook ready. "Will, lad, we've got Tom's letters." And young Tommy saw the black gull in the cove at dusk, not out at sea. "If you know something about Silas, or what happened to Tom, you'd best speak now. It'll go easier for you." His tone was firm, but not unkind, and Miss Marple saw the weight of authority press on Will's fragile resolve. The boy's shoulders slumped, and he sank onto a crate, his hands covering his face. "I didn't want to see it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was in the shed, like I said, mending nets. But I stepped out for air just at dusk, and I saw Silas with Tom down by the cove. They were arguing, loud, about crates and the Coast Guard. Tom said he'd tell, said he'd had enough of hiding it. Then Silas, he grabbed Tom, pushed him into the shallows, held him down." Will's voice cracked, and a sob escaped him. "I ran back inside, didn't want to see more. Silas saw me, though later that night. Said he'd gut me like a fish if I talked." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jane, he saw it. Silas killed Tom, and poor Will's been terrified ever since." Her eyes were wide, but Miss Marple's remained steady, her mind cataloguing every word, every tremble in Will's voice. "You've done well, Will," she said gently, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Truth is a heavy load, but it lightens the heart to share it. In St. Mary Mead, a boy once kept silent about a crime, and it ate at him until he spoke. You've saved yourself that pain." She turned to Poke, her voice calm but firm. "Constable, I believe you have what you need to question Silas Vane more closely. Will's testimony, the letters, the crate, they weave a tight net." Poke nodded, his face grim. "Aye, Miss Marple, I'll bring Silas in tonight. This is enough to hold him, at least till we search his boat." He jotted down Will's words, his pen scratching furiously, and Miss Marple saw the relief in his eyes, as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. As they left the shed, Will remained seated, his head bowed, the weight of his confession lifting but leaving him fragile. Mrs. Bantry, her excitement barely contained, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, we've got him. Silas is the murderer, isn't he?" Will saw it all. "Oh, it's like something out of a novel." Her scarf fluttered wildly, and Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl against the evening chill. "Not quite the end, Dolly," she said softly. "Will's story confirms much, but Silas is a cunning man. In St. Mary Mead, a poacher once swore he was innocent, even with witnesses against him, because he'd hidden his tools well. We must ensure Silas's tools, his knife, perhaps, or his boat tell the same story." Her eyes drifted to the cliffs, where the black gull rocked in the twilight, its dark hull a shadow against the sea. They walked back to the cottage, the village quiet under the first stars. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving together Will's confession, the letter's warnings, the crate's secrets, and Silas's fraying alibi. The truth was near, she knew, as close as the tide that lapped at the cove's edge, ready to reveal what had been hidden. Chapter 11. The smuggler's motive. The dawn broke over St. Mary's Cove with a soft grey light, the sea a muted mirror reflecting the sombre mood of the village. The harbour was quieter than usual, the fishermen's voices hushed as they worked, their glances darting toward the cliffs where the black gull lay moored, its dark silhouette a stark reminder of the unfolding drama. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the small table in Mrs. Bantry's cottage, sipped her morning tea, her knitting needles idle for once as she reviewed the threads of the case in her mind. Mrs. Bantry, bustling about with a tray of toast and marmalade, was a bundle of barely contained excitement. "Jane, we're so close," she exclaimed, setting the tray down with a clatter. "Will's confession, those letters, the crate, it all points to Silas Vane. Do you think he'll confess when Poke questions him?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, gleamed with quiet purpose. "Silas Vane is a man of cunning, Dolly, and cunning men rarely confess easily. But the net is tightening, and even the slipperiest fish cannot escape forever. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who hid his thefts behind a charming smile, but the truth caught him in the end. We must piece together Silas's motive and ensure no thread is left loose." They set out for the police station, where Constable Poke had summoned them to discuss Will's testimony and the evidence from the cave. The station was a hive of activity, with Poke poring over his notebook, his earlobe red from tugging, and a young Coast Guard officer, Jenkins, standing by with a report on the black gull. Pock looked up as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry entered, his face a mix of determination and fatigue. "Miss Marple, you've stirred a hornet's nest," he said, gesturing to the letters on his desk. "Will's story, these letters, and that crate there, enough to bring Silas in for questioning." Jenkins here checked the Coast Guard logs, and the black gull was logged near the cove at dusk, not out past the headland as Silas claimed. Jenkins, a wiry man with a sunburned face, nodded. "Aye, sir. I saw her myself, slipping in close to the cliffs just as the light was fading. Thought it odd, but Silas is known for odd hours. Didn't know about Tom then, or I'd have reported. It's sooner." His voice held a trace of guilt, and Miss Marple noted it, her mind filing away the Coast Guard's oversight as another thread in the tapestry. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice gentle but precise. "Every detail helps." In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper's casual remark about a stranger's boot led us to a burglar. Your sighting of the black gull is much the same, a small thing, but vital. She turned to Poke, her eyes steady. "Have you spoken to Silas?" "Yet, Constable. His alibi is crumbling, and Will's testimony places him at the cove. But we must understand why he acted. Motive, you see, is the heart of the matter." Poke nodded, his hand straying to his earlobe. "I've sent for him, Miss Marple. He's coming in this morning, though he won't be happy about it. Those letters mention crates in Vane's lot, and the crate we found in the cave had brandy French by the markings. If Tom knew about Silas's smuggling and threatened to talk, that's reason enough to silence him." Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, leaned forward. "Silas must have been desperate, Constable. Smuggling's a risky business, and Tom was no fool. He'd have gone to the authorities, wouldn't he? That's why Silas drowned him in the shallows, to make it look like an accident." Her scarf fluttered as she gestured, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle nudge, her smile reproving. "Perhaps, Dolly," she said, "but we must be certain. The shallows are a curious choice, shallow enough to seem accidental, yet deep enough to drown a man if held down. It suggests planning, not panic. In St. Mary Mead, a man once staged a fall to hide a murder, but the angle of the body betrayed him. Silas's motive, I think, lies in what Tom knew and what he might have done with that knowledge. They moved to a small room at the back of the station, where Poke had arranged for Silas Vane to be questioned. Silas entered, his lean frame taut, his slate-grey eyes wary as they flicked over the group. His oilskin coat was damp from the morning's mist, and the knife at his belt gleamed dully. He sat, his posture defiant, and fixed Poke with a cool stare. "What's this about, Poke? More village gossip? I've told you I was at sea when Tom died." Poke laid the letters on the table, his voice steady. "These say different, Silas. Tom wrote to his wife about crates in the cliffs, about Vane's lot. We found a crate of brandy in that cave, and young Tommy saw your boat in the cove at dusk. Will Cody says he saw you with Tom, arguing, then holding him under. Care to explain that?" Silas's jaw tightened, and his hand twitched toward his knife, a reflex Miss Marple noted with interest. "Will's a liar," he said, his voice low and edged. "Scared boy, jumping at shadows. And those letters. Tom was always making trouble, poking where he shouldn't. I told him to stay clear of my mooring, but he wouldn't listen. Doesn't mean I killed him." His eyes met Miss Marple's, challenging, but she saw the strain in them, the flicker of a man cornered. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but piercing. "Mr. Vane, Tom Pierce, was a successful fisherman with what some called uncanny luck. But luck, I find, is often knowledge. Did he discover your trade brandy, perhaps, or tobacco, hidden in that cave? And did he threaten to expose you to the Coast Guard or the revenue men? In St. Mary Mead, a man once killed to protect a secret far smaller than smuggling. Motives, you see, can be simple but deadly." Silas's smile was thin, almost a sneer. "You're a clever old lady, aren't you? But you've no proof. Tom was drunk, maybe, or slipped on the rocks. The sea took him, not me." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his hands, the way they clenched the edge of the table. Poke pressed further, his notebook open. "We'll search the Black Gull, Silas. If we find more crates, or anything linking you to that cave, your story won't hold. We'll saw you hold Tom under. That's murder, plain and simple." Silas's eyes darkened, but he said nothing, his silence as telling as any confession. As they left the station, Mrs. Bantry was practically bouncing. "Jane, he's guilty. You saw his face. He didn't deny it, not really. And that knife, do you think it's the one he used to threaten Will?" Her voice was a mix of triumph and indignation, and Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "He is a man in a corner, Dolly," she said softly, "and cornered men make mistakes. Silas's motive is clear. Tom threatened his smuggling, a trade that likely brought him wealth and power in this village. But we need more than motive. In St. Mary Mead, a man's guilt was proven by a single button left at the scene. We must find Silas's button, perhaps on his boat, or in the cove itself." They walked toward the harbour, the village waking fully now, its rhythm unbroken despite the shadow of murder. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving together Will's testimony, the letters, the crate, and Silas's evasions. The motive was clear, but the proof was near, hidden in the tides. Secrets waiting to be pulled ashore. Chapter 12. The net closes. The evening sky over St. Mary's Cove was a deep indigo, pricked with the first stars as the village settled into a restless quiet. The harbour, usually alive with the clatter of nets and the shouts of fishermen, was subdued, as if holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple sat in Mrs. Bantry's cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her eyes were distant, tracing the pattern of clues that had woven together over the past days. Mrs. Bantry, pacing. The small parlour was a bundle of nervous energy, her scarf trailing behind her like a comet's tail. "Jane, it's all coming together, isn't it?" she exclaimed, pausing to gesture wildly. "Silas Vane, the smuggling, Will's confession, surely it's enough to arrest him." "Oh, I can't bear the suspense." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her smile gentle, but her mind as sharp as ever. "Indeed, Dolly, the net is nearly drawn, but we must be certain every knot is tight. In St. Mary Mead, I once saw a man nearly escape justice because a single clue was overlooked, the thread on a hedge, of all things. Silas Vane is cunning, but the truth is like the tide, it always comes in." She rose, her shawl neatly draped, and gestured toward the door. "Let us join Constable Pock at the harbour. I believe he has news." They made their way to the docks, where the air was thick with the scent of salt and tar, and the sea murmured secrets against the rocks. Constable Pock stood near the Black Gull, his face grim but resolute, flanked by Jenkins, the Coast Guard officer, and 2 burly fishermen drafted as temporary deputies. A small crowd had gathered, their whispers a low hum, their eyes fixed on Silas Vane, who stood by his boat, his lean frame taut with defiance. His slate-grey eyes flicked over the group, lingering on Miss Marple with a mix of wariness and disdain. "Jane, look at him," Mrs. Bantry whispered, clutching her friend's arm. "He knows he's caught, doesn't he, Miss Marple?" Gaze remained steady, noting the way Silas's hand hovered near the knife at his belt, a reflex now as familiar as the tide. Poke stepped forward, his notebook clutched tightly. "Silas Vane," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We've searched the Black Gull, found 3 more crates of brandy, hidden under the deck, with the same markings as the one in the cave. Will Cody saw you with Tom Pierce in the cove, holding him under. Tom's letters warned of your smuggling, and young Tommy saw your boat there at dusk. You've no alibi left, Silas. It's time to talk." Silas's lips curled in a sneer, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. "You've got nothing solid, Pock," he said, his voice low and edged. "A boy's word, some letters, of it proves murder. Tom drowned, plain and simple. The sea's a killer, not me." His hand strayed to the knife, and Jenkins tensed, his hand on his own belt. Miss Marple stepped forward, her slight figure commanding attention despite the tension. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice as mild as a summer breeze, "you are a man who values control, but control slips when secrets are threatened. Tom Pierce discovered your smuggling brandy, perhaps tobacco, hidden in that cave. He threatened to expose you, didn't he, to the Coast Guard, the revenue men. A man like you, with a trade built on shadows, could not allow that. So you lured him to the cove, under pretense of a deal, and held him in the shallows until he breathed no more. The shallow water was clever, it looked like an accident, but you underestimated Tom's strength and the tide's honesty." Silas's jaw clenched, and the crowd murmured, their eyes wide. "You're a meddling old woman," he spat, "but—" His voice shook, and Miss Marple saw the crack in his facade, as clear as a fault in stone. "You've no proof I touched him." Poke raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "We've more than you think, Silas. Found your knife's sheath in the cove, tangled in seaweed near where Tom lay. It's got your initials carved in it, and the blade matches same length as the nick on Tom's oilskin. You dropped it in the struggle, didn't you? He held up a leather sheath, its edges worn but the initials SV. Clear, and Silas's face paled, his hand dropping from the knife at his belt. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her scarf fluttering. Jane, they've got him. The sheath, the cratesits, all there. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving Silas, who stood like a cornered animal, his defiance crumbling. It was no accident, Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. In St. Mary Mead, a man once thought he'd hidden a crime by staging a fall, but a single button betrayed him. Your sheath, Mr. Vane, is your button. Tom fought, didn't he? He was strong, but you were desperate. You held him under, in water shallow enough to deceive, but the sea kept your secret only so long. Silas's shoulders slumped, and his eyes, once sharp, grew dull. He wouldn't let it go, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Tom saw the crates, followed me to the cave. Said he'd tell the Coast Guard, ruin me. I offered him a share, but he wanted it all. I had no choice. His words were a confession, wrung from him by the weight of evidence, and the crowd gasped, their whispers rising like a tide. Pock signalled to the deputies, who stepped forward to restrain Silas. You're under arrest for the murder of Tom Pierce, he said, his voice firm. As they led Silas away, his knife confiscated and his hands bound. The village seemed to exhale, the tension breaking like a wave on the shore. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry returned to the cottage, the night now fully settled, the stars bright. Above the cliffs, Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair, her excitement giving way to awe. Jane, you're a marvel. The way you saw it, all the letters, the crate, Will's fear, that sheath. It's like you knew from the start. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. Not from the start, Dolly. The village told the story, as villagers do. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer once cheated his scales and thought himself clever, but the weights gave him away. Silas Vane's greed was his undoing, and the sea, in its way, spoke for Tom. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as the tide dot. As the fire crackled, Mrs. Bantry sighed. What a tale to tell back home. But Jane, what now? Back to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her gaze drifting to the window, where the sea whispered beyond. For now, Dolly, we rest. But the world, you know, is never short of stories.